Yes, you are live. All right. Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the JavaScript Rockstar Show, brought to you by the Moroccan Angular developer community. Thank you, all of you guys, for joining us today, and I hope you're doing very well. Today, we are joined by John Papa, who is developer advocate at Microsoft, to talk about Preload strategies and how to improve user experience and build fast web apps. How are you doing, John?
Very good. How are you doing?
Fine. I'm glad to have you today. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, all right, John, you can go ahead.
Sounds great. Everybody, thank you so much for coming today, and I hope that you find it interesting. My talk today is about preload strategies with Angular, and I put this to the theme of step in time, which is a line from a great movie that I love because I'm a big Disney fan, and that's Mary Poppins. So Mary Poppins has this great expression, and she says, "It's impossible, you say? Well, everything is possible, even the impossible." And that's kind of the thought behind preload strategies with Angular. When we build applications, we're building them not for us or for the computers. We're building them for the users who use our programs, who use our web apps, use our mobile apps. And the users don't care that we wrote it in Angular. They don't care if we write it with React. They don't care what features that we use. All they care about is that the app works, it does what they want, and it's fast. Nobody wants to wait 5, 10, 20, 40 seconds for a web page to load or transition. So this is the thought behind preload strategies, is how can we take the tools that we have and make them work for us to build a better experience for the users. So we have some things today that help. And one of those is eager and lazy loading. So when we talk about eager and lazy loading for Angular, we're talking about routes mostly. So routing modules will load eager by default and lazy load if we set it up. But let's explore what this does. When we use eager loading, everything is connected to the first initial load of the application. The user presses the button to go to your website. The whole application takes some time to get together and it loads into the browser, but it's loading every feature in your app because that's eager. So what is the user experience? They're waiting for everything to load up front. So then we think about, well, how can we take some of those features that they're maybe not using or maybe have no intention of using at all and defer, wait, lazy load those. So lazy loading lets users wait so they can just load the parts of the app they need up front, the eager parts, and then we can load the lazy parts when they navigate to a route. Now notice the thing they both have in common. Both of these are making users wait. It's, do you want to wait now or do you want to wait later? So how do we balance these? Eager loading, everything is up front. So let's say the app takes 10 seconds to load. That's not great, but let's say that's what it is. And it has maybe 10 eagerly loaded routes. Everything takes 10 seconds, but once it's loaded, it's super fast because everything's in the browser. With lazy loading, maybe we load 2 of those features up front and the other 8 are all lazy. So maybe they wait 2 seconds up front, they get the app, and then every time they route to a new module for the first time, they wait 1 second or 2 seconds to load each lazy loaded route. So they're waiting a little bit up front and a little bit later on. We're just spreading out the waiting. Neither one is great. Well, this is where preloading comes in. Preloading helps you control the user experience. This is where you control what happens to those users. So another way to look at this is we've got eager, we've got lazy. We want to put something in between where you control that user experience. So improving the experience, we're going to manipulate the JavaScript bundles so they work just in time or step in time. Let's take a look at how this works inside the browser by exploring the network tools. We'll kind of explore what preloading does for the user. So here we're going to watch network traffic. Across the way, we can see, let's say an application gets loaded at different points in time. All the content on the left, all that's right below that 5,000 milliseconds, that's all the eagerly loaded content right there. The content on the right, that's lazy loaded or preloaded, lazy loaded it could be. What's actually happening here is all the content that's coming across the wire, right up until about the 10-second mark. All that content is eager, and it's called the time to first interactivity, TTI, and you can learn more about this from this link. Time to interactivity means that it's taking, in this case, 10 seconds before the app is really usable. And then as soon as it's usable, we're going to tell the browser, okay, the user can start using you, but now go ahead and preload some other bundles in the background. That way, when the users go use those features, there's nothing to wait for. It's kind of the best of both worlds, where you get the part loaded up front that you need, and then you start preloading other stuff later. Here's an example of browsing to a site, and what I've done is I have turned on slow Wi-Fi. So you're going to see this little video here of what's happening when I load this site over slower Wi-Fi. Here we can start seeing the content is coming across. There's all the eagerly loaded content. The longer stuff is coming through. This might be like your vendor bundles if you have a lot of third-party stuff. And notice the application starts to become usable right here. And then other stuff comes across the wire at the end, which is preloaded content. Notice we've got some preloaded content right around 25 seconds. Again, I slowed it down so we could see all this. So all the stuff on the far right, we're emulating 3G here, slow 3G. All the stuff on the far right is the content that's been preloaded, so we don't have to wait for it when we go to it later. So let's talk about how we get this kind of an experience and what this does for us. When you navigate to a route, we have to think about what Angular does. So first thing, Angular has a router, and when the router makes this network request to get a new module, that's the first step when you go to a new route. It says, okay, I'm going to do a new route. The router is going to go make a network request to get that JavaScript bundle. If I go to the customers route, it's going to go look for the customers bundle. And then Angular is going to fetch that bundle. And then the users are going to wait, right? So it's got to wait for the bundle to be fetched. It's got to wait for the bundle to come back. And then after it gets back, it's got to wait for the browser to parse it and for Angular to do whatever it needs to do to display things. So it makes the users wait. This is how the router works. Now we can do preloading strategies to make it such that we can skip this whole experience and do this in the background while the users are using parts of our app. So there's different kinds of preload strategies that'll do this for us. Out of the box, if you do nothing, you get the default behavior. This is where modules don't preload at all. They only get loaded when you navigate to the route. So if you're using lazy loading routing and you go to a customer route, it's going to not preload it. It's going to wait until you ask for it, then go get it and parse it and bring it to the browser. There's another strategy that comes with Angular called Preload All. Preload All is when everything gets preloaded up front. It's almost the opposite of what you want because it sounds great. It's like, wow, we're just going to preload everything and the users will be happy. But if you've got a lot of modules, you're probably going to be preloading a lot of different things that the users may not even need. And you don't really control the order that it comes across the wire. So now the users get their stuff up front quickly, yes, but then you might have 10 other modules you preload, which all come in at different times. So which ones are usable and which one comes first? Another thing is if you're on a slow Wi-Fi network or you're paying for Wi-Fi for your cell phone for data, you may not want to put all that burden on the person's Wi-Fi. For example, if somebody has slow Wi-Fi and they pay by the data, by the megabyte, Do you really want to preload everything even if the users aren't going to use it? That's not really nice. So we have something in between. And the in between is a custom preload strategy. This is where you decide how to preload your JavaScript bundles. So let's look at how preloading works. So we learned how the router handles getting the bundles. Now imagine we do a navigation. We're going to navigate to a route. The first thing the router is actually going to do is going to say, is the module that I need already loaded in the browser or isn't it? If it's already loaded, it's already got it, we're done. But if this is the first time it's been asked for, it's going to find out, hey, do I need this bundle? And then before it goes and gets it, it's going to say, are there any unloaded modules that need to be preloaded? So we know that we need the one we're routing to, but are there any other bundles that should be preloaded right now? And you can mark them as being needed to be preloaded. And whichever ones are marked such, those ones will go and get loaded by the browser. So we can tell the browser which ones to preload, and every time a routing navigation occurs, Angular will check to see, should any more be preloaded? Let's go. So how do you set this up? Let's take a look at the no preloading first, because it's the easiest one, because it's the default. Inside of your ng module or your app module, we can set up our router module, and we pass to it routes. Everybody does that? We're comfortable here. The second parameter is a preloading strategy. Out of the box, the default strategy is no preloading. You can also assign it just like this. So here I'm saying, don't preload anything. Now the same object, you can pass to it another strategy for preloading everything. This is the other out-of-the-box experience Angular has. So now we say the preloading strategy is to preload all modules. So easily we can change this by setting a single setting. The question is, should you do all or nothing, or should you preload everything up front? The answer really is customizing. Preload strategies are great. So let me show you a couple of the ones that I like, and you can write any that you like as well. And hopefully this gives you ideas on ways that you can handle preloading strategies. So we'll take a look at a few of these. First one is you opt in or out. This means that you decide which ones you want to preload. If you have 10 preloaded, lazy loaded modules, 10 of them, you can decide, I want these ones to be preloaded and those ones I don't. It's just a simple yes, no Boolean. This would be useful if you're in an application where people use a couple of modules all the time. Maybe it's a customer's application and all the customers and orders. Yes, preload those. Stuff about HR and admin and user settings, maybe don't preload those. Another one is based upon the network speed. You might want to preload things when the network is fast. And maybe it's in combination with the opt-in, opt-out. Yes, preload these ones over here if the network speed is fast. If the network speed is slow, don't preload. Or maybe if somebody has data saver turned on their cell phone, don't preload. Because data saver is a way you're telling your users, tell your phone, I don't want to spend any more than I have to. One of my favorites is when we combine these with some others like predictive behavior. Can you predict, based upon how your users use your application, which modules they're going to need next? In some cases, we can. For example, imagine you go to a website for shopping. You go to like an Amazon type site. When you search for things, you're going to do a search for, let's say, water, and you search for water bottles, and you want to see those. When you see the search results, the odds are very high that once you start hovering with your mouse over the search results, you're going to click on one to go see the details of that product. Now imagine that those are different routes, different lazy loaded routes. Do I want to wait to lazy load the product details for the water when the user clicks on it, which makes them wait? Or if I know that most of the time, 90% of the time, let's say, a user is hovering over the search results, that they're going to click on one of those. Why not preload it while they're hovering? We can capture that with a mouse move event over the items. And we can predict that we need to lazy load that other module. So we can do these things based upon user behavior. There's many examples like this. Another one is there's a great tool that Minkovichev wrote from the Angular team that's open source called Quick Links. And on that one, anytime there's a menu link on the page that links to a lazy loaded route, the browser identifies that and automatically preloads those lazy loaded routes. So there's lots of cool ways that we can do this. When we're creating a custom strategy, and I'll show you what these three do, and I'll give you the source code, you'll get everything you're seeing today. When we create these, there's a couple things we have to do. First, we have to implement the interface. Excuse me. There's a preloading strategy interface that we can implement, and it has a single function in it called preload. And then we'll implement that function. Then we'll write the custom logic for how we want preloading to occur inside that function. And then finally, we'll apply it to the routes. So we have to create the strategy, implement the function, and then apply it to whatever routes that we want it to apply to. So you can selectively do it or apply to them all. And with that set up, let's go take a look at some of these preload strategies. And I think I had mentioned you're going to get all this code. So let me go ahead and 1, 2, 3. Let's zoom in a little bit or a lot. This application, I'll give you the source code, the GitHub link later on. You can see here it's called Angular Preload. I'm also going to show you what it looks like online. If you want to try it online, I will bring it over to this window. The URL is right here. Let me put it in this page. Bear with me. If you want to go see it, you can go see it at this hyperlink right here, right now. So we can call this the live demo is here. All right. So we've got our live demo. You can go to papa-demo.dev, and that shows this page. And I'll zoom in on this a little bit. This application is all about Mary Poppins, the movies. There's 2 Mary Poppins movies, the original, and then there was a new one. And we can click on different buttons here. And what's happening with each one of these is that it's showing us different data. There's heroes, there's villains, there's an admin area, there's an about page, and there's a sign in. Now, I may want to preload these at different times. So let's go into the application itself. And let's close all the windows. First thing we're going to look at is the app module. And in the app module, the version that you're seeing online is running the last one. I'm going to comment that out, and I'm going to show you the first one. So here is no preloading. We'll run this locally for a minute. And I'm going to run npm run full stack. Is it full stack? Maybe I run quick, I think. Yep. Oops, I'm in the wrong place. Let me go back and check out master branch. This is what happens when I code too quickly. I'm in the wrong branch. All right, now we're in master. Let me do a pull. Okay, so once again, we're going to run with no preloading. I'm going to run npm script called quick. What quick is going to do is going to run the Angular app with a fake database in the back end. You can use this database then. You don't have to worry about setting up an actual database. And then it's going to launch the app locally in my browser. The no preloading, we're going to see how we have different routes in the application. I'll go show you this in the router. We have movies, heroes, villains, and admin, and about. We have 5 different lazy loaded routes. Now, out of the box, none of those should preload with this particular setting because we haven't set up any preloading to work yet. We just told it don't preload. So let's show this side by side. Here's the routes, and there's the preloading strategy over here on the left. And there's our Angular app. And this is running locally. Anytime I talk about preloading, I open up the browser tools, and I'll make this bigger. And we'll go to the network tab, and I'm going to refresh. So here on the right, we can see, and I'm not throttling at all, it's on a fast connection. we can see that here's all the files that got loaded. Notice we have one module. Here's a tip. In the filter, if I type in module, you're only going to see the modules, which is great. So here we can see that this module is loaded. It's the movies module because that's what I'm on. Now, there's also a heroes module, which is actually loading right here. And then there's a villains module, and an admin, and an about, and some others. Now I'm going to sign in. It's actually a fake sign in. And now when I click through these, you'll notice that it didn't preload anything until I got to those pages. All those modules came later. That's what these little dots are over here on the right. That's no preload. Now let's switch this to preload everything. It's rebuilding, it's compiling, and it should launch our application again. Now notice I'm on the sign-in page, and it's already preloaded movies, heroes, villains, and about. So it preloaded everything that it could preload up front. Notice again, you can see the bars over here on the right, sorry, the left, that's the initial code. And then over here, you can start seeing the preloader of modules. The application was usable somewhere in between those two places. So the preloading allows us to get all the content up front, and then later on, we get the other stuff before they use it. Then I can jump between things, and nobody's worrying about how long it takes to go from page to page. But notice I never got to the admin page. I said that there were 5 lazy loaded routes, but yet you're only seeing 4. Because preloading works on the router, it also works with route guards. So there's a route guard on the admin page that says, do not even load this JavaScript unless you're logged in and you have admin permissions. So now if I go to admin, this was where the admin would show up later on. So the way we do this here is we have preloaded all of this case. Now let's go look at preload with this opt-in strategy. Now the opt-in is interesting. I'm going to close the router just so we can see this all one screen for a minute. And I'm going to go show you by hovering over opt-in what the strategy looks like. This strategy implements the preload strategy. That's an interface. And then that implements the preload function. The preload function has 2 parameters. The first one is the route. So you can find out where you're trying to go. What are you trying to preload? And the second one is a load function. The load function, you want to call that if you want to preload it, and you don't call anything if you don't want to preload. So that's how you decide to preload or not. So in here I'm saying if the route has a data property, which has a preload property, which is true, then we're going to console log, and we're going to return load. That means we're looking for something on the route that has a preload property. Let's go look at the router file again. Notice here on line 9, I've got a preload property in the data. The preload property here is set to true on line 9, line 15, on the villains, and on the admin. Let's go ahead and remove that from the villains. Let's just comment out the line. And in our app module, remember, we're implementing the opt-in preload strategy. So now what should happen is it should not find a data preload true for villains. So it should preload everything except for the villains. Let's go take a look. I'll refresh. Now we've got the movies and the heroes, and it didn't do a couple others. Let's take a look at why. We've got movies and heroes. We expected heroes. We expected it to not do the villains. We expected it to do the admin, but it did not. Why? Because there's a guard on here saying don't even load it if you can't. Let's remove that guard now. Let's go back and reload. Now notice admin is here when it refreshes. And then there's the about. Now the about one doesn't have the preload true either. So let's go ahead and let's take this line of code and put it down here. And now when we refresh, we should see about show up as well. Now when we go to villains, we should see it come later. So now it becomes on demand. So this allows us to have some level of control over how we're doing this. I'll remove that from here again. So that's the opt-in. This is a relatively simple strategy. You can opt in and it will load your stuff. Now let's take a look at the console log, because in the console, this is really interesting. It shows you what's happening. And I'll refresh again. So now we're getting the heroes, the movies, and the admin only. We're not getting the villains or the about. And notice it's telling us down here what's happening. That's preloading the heroes and the admin and the movies. Now when I go over to about, we got the about. And when I go over to villains, oh, I'm not logged in. Okay, now I go to villains. It was there. So we can see what's happening when it reloads all this. None of the preloading happened for those because we didn't tell it to preload them. So you can take a look at the console log in this application to see what's happening. And I believe in the live app, you can also see what's being loaded right in the console log. All right, so let's take a look at the second one, because these get more interesting as we go. So we started with no preloading, went to preloading everything. Then we went to preload only the ones I tell you to preload. Now let's go to network preloading. This one checks to see how good is your network. A little more code here. Let's break this down. Here, we've got our preload strategy, which is saying if you have a good connection, then preload. Well, what is a good connection? This is your custom code. Good connection here. I'm first checking to see on line 14, can I access the Navigator connection object? This is a object that's available in the modern browsers. You can check the Can I Use website to find out if your browser supports it. You can go to Can I Use. We can look for the connection. And let's go to Navigator, actually. Here's the Navigator API, and you can see all the modern browsers support this, which is great. And then once you have that, you can continue. Line 15 is saying right here, if for some reason you have a browser that doesn't support this, just get out. It's not a good connection. The odds are if they have a really old browser, it's not going to load fast anyway. So let's not preload. So here we're saying we have the new connection object. Line 16 says, now, maybe you're on a mobile phone. I've got an iPhone here. Maybe I'm in a really poor reception area, bad reception. So if that's the case, maybe I turn on Data Saver in my phone. A lot of people do this. If Data Saver's on, I don't want you sending me a lot of JavaScript. So in that case, I'm returning false if Data Saver's on. Line 19, now we're getting to the real code. We're checking to see, okay, if you're running 2G or 3G, don't preload. That's what I want to say. So I'm saying avoid those connections. And I'm checking here on the Navigator object, it's got an effective type. The effective type tells you what does it think the speed is for this phone. So in your browser, part of the API of Navigator is it will tell you, I think your phone has 3G speeds. If that's the case, it's going to match this on line 21. We're going to say avoid these connections includes the effective type. If it does, we're going to return false and say, this is a slow connection. Let's not preload. I don't want to really tie up all their users' bandwidth to do this. Let's say I think 3G is okay. I could just remove 3G from that, and then therefore it would be fast. It would preload everything with 3G and up. So I'm just deciding, true or false, what's a good connection. And then based upon that, on line 10, I'm going to run the load function if I want it to preload, or I'm going to run empty if I don't. Now let's take a quick second to talk about empty. Empty is an observable of never, which means it's never going to happen, which is great. So there's empty is a keyword from RxJS that you can import. You can see on line 3. So I can load or I can do empty. Well, let's take a look at this. On the network aware, if we go back into my browser, this is locally, and I'm going to refresh, and then I'm going to sign in. Now you'll notice that I preloaded everything here. Everything ended up getting preloaded. I don't be logging on for this one, but all the stuff got preloaded because it detected that I had a fast speed. Now, if I slow down to something like fast 3G, let's refresh. It'll definitely take longer, and it's coming across the wire, and you'll start seeing what's actually happening. Now remember, I have modules showing up in the filter up here. I can remove that real quick. You can see all the files are coming across the wire. We'll get rid of the console. We'll let this run for a little bit because it takes a little bit of time. This is why you don't want to tie up the user's browser connection if they have a really slow connection. So here we're on 3G, and we did say in our code, if it's 3G, avoid that connection. Don't go there. So therefore, it's loading, and it loaded the villains module only in this case. I think that's because I was trying to go to villains and I wasn't signed in. Let's see. Yep, that's why. So it loaded that one because I was going to villains, but it's not loading any others because it said, hold on, this is way too slow. By the way, a tip, don't ever forget to turn this back off to online. Otherwise, everything looks really slow. So we can see how when I turned it on, I only got this one and it took 40 seconds to get here. Now, if I refresh with a fast speed, everything's preloading because it's so fast. It only took less than a second. Cool. Let's go look at the third and final custom preload. This one's called On Demand, and this is the one that you'll experience in the web app that I just showed you that you can go to. Now, On Demand, let's go look at this one. This one has even more code, and you can combine these with your own logic. Here we're saying we've got a constructor for an on-demand service. Well, what's that? We have an RxJS subject that's telling us when to preload. This is a little more advanced, but it's really cool. So let's set up the stage. In this application, maybe when somebody hovers over one of the menu items, I want it to preload. So let's go to the live one here for a minute, and let's refresh the page. I'm going to make this a little smaller. There we go. We're back on sign in, and I'm going to filter on module. Okay, so we've now filtered on module. We're on the sign in page. I'm okay here. If I go over to about, notice what happened as soon as my cursor hit about. Let me do that again in case you didn't see it. Let's refresh the page. Notice there's nothing in the console, nothing up here. And it's actually going to get rid of that for a minute because it's the names of the bundles in production are actually called ES 2015, something or other. There's a runtime, the polyfills, and the main eager loaded bundle. Now, as soon as I hover over about, watch what happens. A new bundle came across the wire. I didn't touch about, I just hovered over it. And it shows you in the console that we're now preloading that one. If I go up, you're going to see what happens on villains, heroes, and movies. So as I'm hovering over these, it's trying to preload. Now, notice that I'm trying to preload over and over and over again, right? That's not preloading every time. I'm logging it each time, but that's Angular being smart and saying, hey, did I already get this bundle? If I did, just get out. We've already got it. Notice we only get each bundle once, and you can see that in the network tab. If I can make this go down a little. There's our other bundles. There's our main one, and then the 4 others that we received. Mostly the heroes, the villains, and the movies. So how does this work? We want it so that when somebody goes to a web page and they hover over a link, maybe we delay for a second, and then that's the time that we say, go ahead and preload that. So let's go back to our Amazon example. We have a list of products. We're looking for water. As we're hovering with our mouse over the products, maybe that's the key to say, that's the one I want to preload because I think they're going to click on that. So how do we do this? We have an RxJS subject, which will fire whenever we hover or mouse over specific parts of the screen. When that fires, we're going to listen to it. Line 16 says, I'm listening, subscribing to the preload on demand observable. So everything inside of here comes through and says, all right, I just heard this message from RxJS observable saying, we need to preload. Now, we take that and we're using merge map because we want to change from the previous observable. And now we're going to check to see, should we preload this route? We have our own logic called preload check. If we should, then we're going to console log it, and then we're going to try to preload it by calling the load function. So let's see what preload check does. Preload check is not right now saying if the route path, if the path that we're going to, or it's star, if that matches the preload options for route path, and we have a preload option. So what does all that mean? Let's look at what on-demand preload options are. On-demand preload options, right here, it's just a class. It has the subject, which passes in a message. This message right here comes from these demand preload options. And those have three properties. Well, two properties, route path and preload. Should we preload it? The default is true. And what route are we trying to preload? So this is the way in the message that we tell it, you just hovered over the customer's route. Let's pass customers to this message, which then we go back into this code, comes across and says, okay, so the preload options, the route path, this is the one you're trying to load. Customers, does it match the path that you're going to or star? Because we could pass star and say preload everything as well. And we've told it to preload yes. So it's our own logic. We could add in here, notice, a flag, just like we had before for opt-in, to say, also look to make sure that that route is marked for preload. We could also add in, if we wanted, the has good network connection. So you're seeing how you can take a little bit of each of these preload strategies and make it your own. Decide how you want this to behave. So we're looking at the route path and saying, all right, if this route path matches what you've told me to preload, I'll go ahead and do that. So let's see where this gets loaded. I believe it's in the navbar components. There it is. Notice on line 41 for the about, I've got a mouse over event, and I'm firing this function called preload bundle. Preload bundle is going to say, go preload the about page. So let's go look at preload bundle. Down here, I'm calling a service, which then tells it to start the preload. And I pass to it the path. Remember that route path is what we tell the preload strategy. This is the route I want to preload. So here, just to tie the code together, on line 41, we say preload the about route. On line 65, it's going to go tell the service to do that. We come into the service says, okay, you told me to preload the about path. I'm going to take that path, put it in on line 14 as part of the demand preload options, put true for preload, and I'm going to send that as a message to whoever's listening. Well, we know who's listening. It's the on-demand preload strategy who's listening here in the constructor on line 12. And where is he listening? Listening right here on line 16. Says, okay, go get those preload options, line 23. Check to see if this one matches a preloading route, and then go ahead and preload it. And that's why if we come back to the app, we'll refresh. By default, let's say I'm looking, oh, I'm thinking about Heroes. Boom, Heroes gets preloaded. I come back to Heroes, and you can see the count going up in the console, but it's only downloading it once. And then I could say, let's go to Heroes. And if I hover over Villains, it's going to download Villains. And notice now the speed between those two is instant. So we're choosing when to preload. I put mine on mouse hover, mouse over. You could put it anywhere you want. These are your own events. You just tie them into it and call the service. One other feature is, remember I said you could pass star to the route. Well, where would that happen? Let's go back into the nav. In the nav bar, you'll notice there's a preload all on line 50. There's a button called preload all that shows up as the black button over here. So when somebody clicks that, not hovers, but they click that button, and I know you wouldn't have this in your app, but I'm showing how you could do it. On this click, we could have a preload all, which then passes to the start preload star. Star means preload everything. So by doing this, if I refresh the page, and here we are, we have not preloaded, well, we preloaded a little. Let's go to the sign-in page. Cool, we haven't preloaded anything. Now, when I hover over preload all, nothing happens. Because remember, I tied it to click. And when I click on that, notice everything gets preloaded right away. So you can preload one, or you can preload them all. It's really up to how you want to do it. All right. And you get all the code for this. It's up in GitHub. I'll show you links to that at the end of the presentation. So we took a look at 3 specific preload strategies. The first one was called network aware. The network aware tells us, well, it wasn't the first one, it was the second one, but it was the one that tells us, is our network fast enough? If it is, let's preload. We took a look at one called on demand. On demand says, okay, you decide when to preload, mouse over, clicking a button, based on some other user action. You decide it. And then you fire off a behavior subject, you next it, and then that gets fired into the strategy, who then listens to see, should I preload? And then there's a very simple one called the opt-in. This is where you put a preload true flag on your routes for the ones to preload and leave that flag off for the ones you don't want to preload. We also learn how to create one of these strategies. We first create the class that implements the preload strategy. And then we name it after the strategy we want. And then we add in the preload function. The preload function is where we get to decide how to preload. In this case, I'm checking to see if there's a data preload property. Then to apply that preload strategy, we go to the route, and then we add on the route a preload true property. Data : preload : true. Now, if we do the network aware, we had a little more code on this one. There's a preload function for has good connection. We then check to see, do we have data saver on? If so, we don't preload. And then we decide what connection speeds do we want to preload for. We want 3G and 4G to preload, but not 2G. So then we run that code to see, okay, only preload for ones that are the faster speeds. So some final tips for you on preload strategies. Definitely learn these. They're really great for you to use in your applications. I've written several articles on this topic. I'll give you links to those. If you're worried about snippets, remembering the code syntax, I never remember it. Just like you, only so much I can remember. In the snippets, I have Angular snippets that you can download for VS Code, and they will help you write preload strategies. So you type a-preload, and they'll come up. If you want to see this GitHub, you can check it out in the GitHub repository. That's where the full demo is. And you can also try Azure Static Web Apps, which is where I'm hosting the entire demo that you can see from the links here. So the first link is for preloading. The second one is for snippets. The third one is to go to the demo. And then the fourth one is if you want to learn how to host the application in Azure, you can do that too through this link here. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this, and I'd be happy to take any questions that any of you have.
Yep, great. Thank you, John, for the presentation. Let's go over the first one. It's about how to choose the right strategy for my apps.
I'm going to stop screen sharing so you can see me. There we go.
Yep.
Good question. It depends what kind of app you have, I guess. If you really have to think about how your users use the application, if you can study how your users use and behave inside your web app, you can start thinking about, oh, I see where they're going. They often go to the shopping area. They often go to this other place. They never go over to these ones over here. That's a good candidate to start thinking about. Preload the ones they go to. Don't preload the others. Maybe opt in. Network bandwidth is something you have to think about with your users. You can always look at your server logs to see what network, what speeds people have. You can really just decide based upon watching your users' behavior.
Second one, John. Preload is still an appropriate solution for people with strong network. You recommend turning on or off preloading at runtime or not?
This is a great question. So it's an appropriate solution for people with a very strong network. Yes. If they're on a slower network and you can detect this with the browser's navigator connection object, then you could just disable it then. That's why I like the network aware strategy so much, because you can decide at runtime which ones to use. You could even combine the network strategy one with the opt-in, where you just flag all the routes as being preload, but if the network is slow, it wouldn't preload them. That way, if I have a fast connection, I get everything preloaded. If you're on a slow connection, it will not, which is actually better for you.
Great, thanks. Let's get the last one from Chab. Is there any available preloading strategy using Guest.js based on analytics?
There is. That's a great question. Thank you. So the Guest.js tools out there, that's actually part of what Minko Gachev used to write NGX quick links. So NGX quick links, where you can search for Minko Gachev. He's one of the members of the Angular team. He wrote a preload strategy. It's up in NPM now, and it's based upon Guest.js. And I believe what he's done, I haven't looked at it in a couple months, but I believe what he's done is made it so if your menu is on the screen, if your routing link, your router link is available and visible, it'll automatically preload those routes.
Great. All right. Thank you, George, for the awesome talk.
Thank you.
And thank you all of you guys for watching as well. And see you next time. Bye-bye.